It's the 25th dynasty of Egypt, and the Ethiopians are in charge. They have climbed their way into Egypt and turned the tables on the people who had once colonized them. Their civilization is now bending towards the Ethiopians. And because of this, even the foreigners in the Middle East have to deal with these new people who have set themselves up. Talks about these people and whether or not they are the true ancients of ancient Egypt would travel throughout the hundreds and hundreds of years, including, of course, the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians, of course, in some way saw themselves as separate than the Ethiopians, because, of course, you can't colonize yourself. So they must have been a separate empire in some way. Of course, because of the thousands of years of invasions, they must have had a collaborative world. There are writings all over the Middle East that talk about the people that were in charge, the Kushites at the time, and the word being interchanged with the word Egypt. So as we read, Cush, Assyria's rival in the Levant. The second half of the 8th century BC saw the kingdom of Cush, also known as Nubia, rise to a new prominence as its rulers generally extended their control into Egypt. Their newfound power enabled them to play an influential role in politics of the Near East, particularly vis-a-vis the Neo-Assyrian Empire, whose military expansion brought them within striking distance of the Kushites. Every piece of information that was stored by the ancient Egyptians about the people in the Middle East, every piece of trade partner, every piece of everything they ever had for the next few years would be transferred to the people of Kush. Remember that it was only later that the Indians were known to the Europeans in the form of the Greeks, but because of the trade that had happened and the invasions that had happened with Egypt, India was well aware of the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Egyptians were well aware of the Indians. What does this mean? What does this have to do with anything? Well, the reason is because the image that was sent of the ancient Egyptians at this time would be the rulers, and the rulers were the Kushites. And so the image of the ancient Egyptians would persist, at least for a while, as the Ethiopians in culture and strategy and region and religion and everything else because they adopted some of their old religious practices. Let's read again before I give my take on it. Sudan in the early first millennium BC, traditionally the boundaries of the kingdom of Kush stretched southwards from the first Nile cataracts, a rocky, unnavigable stretch of rapids at Aswan in southern Egypt, while its heartland lay between the third and sixth cataracts and was centered on the city of Napata at Jebel Barkal in modern-day Sudan. The region's geographical proximity to Egypt was reflected in the many shared links, cultural, political, economic, and religious, with documented interactions going back to the 4th millennium BC. Now, before we go back to the Assyrians and we go back to the people of Egypt or of Ethiopia, let's first look at another area which we can trace to that time. So this is the platform that's from 6000 BC, closer to 4000 BC, which is in Saudi Arabia. Now, this platform does not represent anything close to what's in Egypt or anything close to what's in Ethiopia, but the reason why I'm putting it here is because I want people to realize the difference between coincidence and correlation. I'll quote Herodotus. I do not know which kingdom inspired which kingdom because they were so close to each other and the tradition is so old in both nations. That was when he was talking about Ethiopia and Egypt. And the reason why this is important is because I want to separate something. I want to separate having a great civilization and having a great civilization right next to another one. It's almost impossible to think that the Ethiopians and the Egyptians grew out of two separate things. And if they grew out of the same thing, it's impossible to imagine that they never at one point fused and merged in that. And I know the mainstream does believe that happened. I just read it. But let's continue, because the only reason I brought up this place is because I want people to realize that, first of all, so the Saudi area, the Saudi Arabian area, its culture is nothing. Its culture, its religion, everything like that is nothing like what was going on in Egypt and Ethiopia. I'll say it again. Ethiopia, in this case, is Sudan and Egypt, like the lower parts of Egypt, what they call Upper Egypt. So if we go back to look at that image that we see there, again, this is clearly an Ethiopian man with Ethiopian hair. And, if you want to, you can call it a wig. I don't mind that they do that as long as they acknowledge that it's Ethiopian. And of course, they've got all these animals that will be listed in a list that they give. Now let's finish reading this part. Kush was a source of, as well, a gateway to a number of prized commodities from the south, including gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and slaves. The Egyptians sought to exploit this and gradually absorbed Kush into their own territory. By the middle of the second millennium BC, Nubia was governed as two separate provinces under the control of the viceroy of Kush. However, with the end of the New Kingdom, 1552 to 1550 to 1069 BC, Egypt's grip on the region was loosened and Kush reverted to local control, capitalizing on Egypt's internal instability. The Kushite kings eventually went to reverse the historical balance of power and to rule Egypt as pharaohs, the 25th dynasty in Egyptian chronology, until the Assyrian conquest of Egypt in 672 BC. So if we reverse time and we figure out what happened to the ancient Egyptians, because remember, the ancient Egyptians had power over the Syrians, where Syria is today. They had power there. Their power was extended all the way. They almost became as big as any other empire at the time, but it shrank. What happened? Well, it was the Assyrians was one of the problems, but things were in turmoil in ancient Egypt. Now, this is why when the Kushites came into power, they had more control over the south and the north of Egypt rather than the Asian territories, because in the Asian territories, war was brewing. We have people like Ashur-Hardin. We have all kinds of names of Assyrians at the time who did not tolerate any nonsense. I mean, they were the first to actually put people in large scale to, let's say, their final resting place because they were insolent. And so, because they were, not doing what they wanted to do, they would take, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000 people and lay them to rest as a symbol that you should listen to what the Assyrians say. And so the movement of the Assyrians was not something small, and the Egyptians, aka the Kushites, were they heard about this. Now, the type of person who would go and, you know, put people to death like that is not going to be exactly a nice person. And the Kushites would learn of this the hard way. Pictured here is Pa's daughter, the godwife of Amun, with the royal uncle and everything like that. So we know for a fact that these people and their names are given are Kushites, and they cemented themselves in the walls. Even though there was a lot of Kushite stuff that was broken off, because of course, you know, ancient Egyptians are not too fond of foreigners. It still was, they still preserved a lot of things that show that they were the true people of the region. So we read, at the time of the conquest by the Kushite kings, political power in Egypt was fragmented among a number of Delta dynasties, many of whom were also tribal chiefs of Libyan origin. Parts of Lower Egypt, the northmost part of the country down to Memphis, approximately 24 kilometers south of Cairo, had been absorbed into the territory controlled from the Delta, while the area south of Hermopolis near the modern town of Malawi in Upper Egypt was under the control of the city of Thebes, itself subject to Kush following the initial expansion by King Kashta in 760 to 747 BC and around 750 BC. Some 20 years later, Kashta's son and successor Pia embarked on a military campaign through Egypt, prompted by the increasing power of the Delta's rulers, particularly Tefnate of Sais, whose march on Memphis had shown a great deal of political and military ambition. Pia's successful campaign was commemorated in the so-called victory stela set up at the temple of Amun at Napata. Copies of it were also displayed at Thebes, Karnak Temple, and Memphis, the religious center of Upper and Lower Egypt. His victories extended Kushite control into Lower Egypt, although it seems that he was content to leave most subjugated local rulers in place. It was left to his successor, Shabako, to consolidate Kushite control throughout Egypt, including the Delta. Now remember, since the invasion of the Mitanni and so many other groups from Asia, the horse had already been introduced into the ancient Egyptian areas. They had dribbled a little bit into Sudan, but they weren't by any means the main way of travel in that area. And remember, Sudan lies in such an area that the influence of the camel had already started at the very low parts of Sudan, which to some degree was not in control of the ancient Egyptians or the Kushites. It was in their control, but not in regionally it was in their control, but you know, to some degree, they were unaware of the true potential of the camel at the time, which is why the next part is about how they realized the power of the horse was what's next. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning this as well, because that's the part that drew me to this part from UCLA, is that you can see how close things can be in history. Like the camel is right there, right at the fingertips of the ancient Egyptians, but it sort of goes over their head a little bit. Horses formed an important part of Kushite culture in the 8th century. In one of the most famous passages, Pierre's victory stela records the great distress felt by the king on discovering starving horses in the stables of a conquered city in Egypt. His Majesty then proceeded to the stables of the horses and the quarters of the fowls. When he saw that they were starved, he said, as I live, as Ra loves me, as my nose is rejuvenated with life, how much more painful it is in my heart that my horses have been starved than any other crime that you have committed at your discretion. Now, these people have listed these perfectly. So now let's talk about the true influence of the Kushites over certain places in the Middle East. Now, with a horse, that means you could travel very long distances. What distances are there outside of, you know, Egypt and Kush? Well, the Middle East is right there. And of course, the Kushites did not miss that opportunity. So it says Pia's inscriptions were accompanied by images of horses, and a team of horses was buried near his own tomb in a pyramid at El Kuru near Napata, a practice adopted by several of his successors. The prominence accorded to his horses seems to be closely linked to military developments in the first millennium BC. Chariotry which dominated armies warfare in the New Kingdom, gradually gave way to cavalry, a technique which necessitated a much closer physical relationship between the rider and his horse. The Cushites' interest in horses was shared by the Assyrians. Technological innovation had turned their chariotry and cavalry into formidable weapons of war and greatly increased the Assyrian need for horses, which was met through tribute and booty, as well as trade. References to Egyptians and Kushite horses in official and administrative texts from Assyria highlights these regions' importance in the international horse trade. Kushite horses in particular were valued for their strength and size and sought after all over the Middle East, including by the charioteers of Israel and Assyria, as was the corresponding expert knowledge. The Nimrud wine lists records of wine ration distributions at the royal court of Kalu attest to the presence of Cushites in Assyrian service as early as 732 BC, which takes me back to this image. And the reason it takes me back to this image is because the Assyrians have been introduced. And so the Assyrians, remember, they inherited a lot of culture from the Sumerians, the Persians, well, not the Persians yet, but the Syrians inherited from the Akkadians, the Sumerians, and all those other people in those regions, and including things like the flood and stuff. And they would claim superiority and even great knowledge of the ancients of those areas. But of course, there were other areas around the world that played importance, and that was Egypt. And clearly, they were interested in Cushites coming into their regions and, you know, having proper trade with them in times of peace. Because, of course, what we see later is war and takeover and all of that. But in times of peace, it was just normal. Now, importantly, the records of different people around the world is more a celebrated thing. That victory stealer that I showed where they dominated the world, there's a reason why all the races are listed there, and that's because they were kind of proud of the fact that there are different people from around the world, and that it feels like you're really doing something big when different nations who look very different from one another are there. So let's read. Figure of a man with an oryx, a monkey, and a leopard skin, 8th century BC. The statuette group carved in the round was found with 5 other statuettes with similar imagery. The 6 statuettes were excavated in and just below 2 arched niches built into the wall of a room of Fort Shalmaneser, who was a king of Assyria, a royal building at Nimrud that was probably used to store goods and tribute collected by the Assyrians while on military campaign. Those found just below the niches could have fallen when the palaces were destroyed during the final defeat of the Assyrian at the end of the 7th century BC. Originally, these objects were attached to long ivory plinths and exhibited in the arch niches, perhaps arranged in a procession of foreigners bringing different animals and animal skins as tribute to the Assyrian king. A frontally facing man, striding to the right with his lower body in profile, grasps the horns of an oryx, a species of desert dwelling antelope, that strides behind him. The male figure's eyes, necklace, and armlet were carved to receive colored glass or semi-precious stone inlays. He wears a short kilt belted with a long sash embroidered with decoration including 2 uria Zigzags, wavy lines, small squares, rosettes, diamonds, and circles. A monkey whose fur is rendered with short incisions, side erect on his left shoulder and grasps his short curly hair. Although his right arm does not survive, it was probably extended to support the elaborately patterned leopard skin draped over his right shoulder. Built by the Assyrian king Ashur-nasir-peral II, the palaces and storerooms of Nimrud housed thousands of pieces of carved ivory. Most of the ivory served as furniture inlays or small precious objects such as boxes, while some of them were carved in same style as the large Assyrian reliefs lining the walls of the northwest palaces. The majority of the ivories display images and styles relating to the arts of North Syria and the Phoenician city-states. Phoenician-styled ivories are distinguished by their use of imagery related to Egyptian art, such as sphinxes and figures wearing pharaonic crowns, and the use of elaborated carving techniques such as open work and colored glass inlay. North Syrian style ivories tend to depict stockier figures in more dynamic composition, carved as solid plaques with fewer added decoratives elements. However, some pieces do not fit easily into any of these three styles. Most of the ivories were probably collected by the Assyrian kings as tribute from vassal states and as booty from conquered enemies, while some may have been manufactured in workshops at Numrid. The ivory tusks that provided the raw materials for these objects were almost certainly from African elephants imported from the lands south of Egypt. Although elephants did inhabit several river valleys in Syria until they were hunted to extinction by the end of the 8th century BC. Now, I'll leave it there for now because I've already given a full take on the war between the Nubians and the Assyrians that came after. But the reason why I'm pointing this out right now is, first of all, the Arabs were not even part of the conversation. So to say that Arabs were the original inhabitants of that region is crazy. But also to show that when other groups came into the picture, the Cushites were seen as the holders or the truth of this kingdom. But more than that is that there's a bunch of people who came from these places and through the Sinai, through Israel, I'll say it again, through Israel, Israel, the land of Israel and Gaza, through that region, they would march their way into Assyria and places like that and work in the Middle East. Cushite people, distinguished from others and noted and written about by the Assyrians, which we'll explore some other time. And of course, they write about the Arabs and how they played their role.